If everything is relative, what can be more relative than relations between the sexes? Every week, your host, Jack Kammer, talks with a man or a woman on the podcasts Men Are Talking or Goodwill Toward Men, and aims to deliver at least one idea that will make you think, wow, I never thought of it like that. Today, Jack talks with a man on Men Are Talking.
Every year, the World Economic Forum issues its Global Gender Gap Report. The media faithfully cover it as a scathing indictment of women's inequality in general, and the patriarchy's oppression of women in particular. Today on Men Are Talking, we talk about that report with Professor David Geary, a noted psychologist and expert on aspirational differences between men and women. He reads the Global Gender Gap Report every year, and he begs to differ. We activists have a meme that sometimes hits our desks. It shows a facsimile of a fake newspaper headline. It says, "World to End Tomorrow." The subheadline is, "Women Hardest Hit."
Right. Yeah, I've seen that one before. And that spells out the general bias of the media and academics and so forth pretty nicely. They're kind of in a constant advocacy position for girls and women, even in areas in which girls and women have now overtaken boys and men.
And do you feel comfortable saying these things on campus?
Do I feel, I teach a sex differences course, and it's biologically based and reality based. And I talk about areas where men have advantages and where women have advantages and where they're the same and so forth. I don't pull too many punches. It's easier though, working off campus. And when you do this type of work, you just kind of don't have to deal with folks.
Do you sometimes feel a little chill or a cold shoulder from time to time?
Well, sure. Yeah. I've been doing this type of work for 25, 26 years or so. And, it fluctuates in terms of the environment, in terms of sending it to journals for reviews, how editors deal with it, how journal reviewers deal with it, interactions at conferences, on campus, and so forth. Yeah, there's often a bit of tension there. But thankfully, I'm relatively socially insensitive, and so that helps quite a bit.
You got some thick emotional skin, I take it.
Yeah, I don't know if thick emotional skin is part of it. Just getting accustomed to it is part of it, and part of it is just indifference. I mean, the data and people's emotions and opinions about it are, may or may not line up with the data. I'm not worried.
So maybe it's better to say you have thick intellectual skin.
There we go. That's good.
Okay, very good. Okay, well then, let us tell our audience about the report that you have done such a good job of critiquing.
Right. So this is done by, as you noted, by the World Economic Forum. They produce every year the Global Gender Gap Index, GGGI, and it is used as a measure of women's empowerment. I mean, it's designed to measure women's empowerment, but it's often interpreted as a measure of gender equality. So it looks at things such as healthy lifespan, participation in the labor force, number of women in parliament, wages, and so forth, participation in education, and that. And they set it up so that they rate women's performance relative to that of men. So as I mentioned in the article, if there are 150 representatives in whatever country, at the national level, and 50 are women and 100 are men, then on their index, women are at a 0.5 or 50% of that of men. And they do that for all sorts of measures from, as I said, schooling, health, economic, social, political, participation, and so forth, and then come up with an index to say kind of how are women doing relative to how men are doing overall and in these three areas and across nations. One of the critiques we had with the index was that if there is a situation where women are doing better than men, say in educational settings, which they are, then they cap the index at 1, meaning that the best that any country could do on this index is perfect equality. It will never measure any situation or allow for the measurement of any situation in which women or boys are doing worse than men. And so
women or girls are doing.
Well, sorry. Women or girls are doing better than boys or men. That's counted as equality, not as a sex difference. They also, and so if we look at things like health and stuff, you get equality on this measure more or less in most places, even though women live longer than men, that's considered equal in their minds. Now, there are differences. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the anomalous fact that you point out in your article about how equality on life expectancy is not 1.0, it's 1.06.
Right. Yeah, so they expect women to live longer than men. And if they don't live, they expect them to live like 6 years longer or 5 years longer. I don't remember exactly what it is. But if they're living only 2 years longer, then it's counted as a disadvantage for women.
And it's evidence of some bad treatment of women.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the interpretation of it. Yeah.
So, okay.
And then on the other, yeah.
It's mind-boggling that they can do that, and it's also mind-boggling that they can truncate advantages that women have at 1.0 so as to sort of sweep them under the rug.
Right, that's exactly what they do, and they're not bashful about it in their long report. They basically say this is a measure of women's empowerment, relative economic, political, and health sorts of things relative to men, which is fine, but it's always touted as a measure of equality. The media picks it up, and in their own press releases, they kind of imply that this nation or that nation or the whole world needs to do more for women in order to get us equal.
Well, even as a measure of empowerment, it's flawed and suspect because in those realms in which women have an excess of power, that too is under the rug. Right.
Not even mentioned. And they don't even take into consideration women's preferences. So we know from large-scale studies that women are more variable in their preferences than men in terms of work-life balance. There are many more men than women who are really career-focused, 50, 60-hour-a-week sorts of guys looking for status. And then there's some women who would prefer that as well. Then there are also some women who would prefer not to work outside of the home, just to work with the kids. Most women are kind of in between, where they want to have a family. They also want to have some outside work, but they don't want to work 50, 60 hours a week and have the high stress and pressure. And those types of trade-offs, which are very, very well documented, result in differences in the number of men and women who go into high status careers, who go into politics, who are successful economically in terms of, whatever investments they make or wages or whatever. So those differences in preferences and choices lead to differences in outcomes, political in the political arena, the economic arena, so forth. And these are the same outcomes that is measured by the GGGI. And in every country, it shows disparities, meaning that women are, there aren't as many women in parliament as men. Women aren't making as much money as men. There aren't as many CEOs that are women relative to men, and so forth. And so all of these are then tagged as an indication of bias against girls and women, completely ignoring a very large literature on sex differences in the life-work trade-offs that men and women prefer. And I argued in that article, and my colleague, with my colleague of mine, Heesbert Stoet, argued that if you take these trade-offs into account, in most highly developed nations, men and women are both doing pretty well, and there really isn't much of a gap. And we actually developed an alternative measure.
I'll get to that in a second.
That looks at.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
We'll get to that in a second. That's do you call it the BIGI? BIGI?
The BIGI, right.
Okay.
BIGI.
Okay, very good. Before we get to the BIGI, I want to mention another large body of data that you cited to back up your point, and that's the study of mathematically precocious youth, SMPY. You want to talk about what that demonstrates?
Yeah, that is a great study. It's run by David Levinsky and Camilla Benbow out of, they're currently at Vanderbilt. So this was taking thousands of kids who are identified as high achievers when they were like 11, 12, 13 or so forth in there. They're given the SAT at that point and other measures. And then they've been followed for 40 plus years. So some of those individuals are now in their 50s, and they'll be followed presumably throughout their entire lifespan. There's different cohorts. So some of them are a little younger, some of them are a little older, but it's a huge, in a very long-term longitudinal study of mathematically, verbally, spatially gifted individuals. And what they find there is that these people are disproportionately successful later in life. They're almost all of them, or the vast majority, are college educated. Large numbers of them get PhDs or MDs or become lawyers or CEOs of large companies. They're extremely successful. But there are also some interesting sex differences. And these begin to emerge when these individuals hit their 30s or so. And there you begin to see trade-offs where these very bright, very talented women, at least a large number of them, are spending less time on career focus and more time on family, friends, kind of social, personal sorts of interests rather than status related and occupational interests. And so what you wind up with is the guys are working many more hours than the women are, and are, as a result, once you start to see these trade-offs in the 30s, the outcomes begin to kind of stretch apart as well. But both the men and the women in this, in these cohorts in this study, are equally satisfied with their life. So there's no dissatisfaction, no feeling that they're being forced. The men aren't complaining that they need to work 50, 60 hours a week to keep up in their fields. And the women aren't complaining that, well, they're falling behind in their field because they're only able to work, 30 hours a week or whatever it is they're working. So life satisfaction is the same, but trade-offs are clearly there.
Well, let me ask you about that indicator, that measure of life satisfaction. Mm-hmm. what occurs to me is that there might be some confounding factors in that measure, in that instrument. Mm-hmm. For instance, are men and women equally disposed to voicing unhappiness about their situations? Do we know about that? Has that been studied? Is that considered? I can tell you that my bias would be to observe that the fairy tale isn't about the prince and the pea. Mm-hmm. It's about the princess and the pea.
That's right.
And men are encouraged to, quote unquote, man up.
Right.
If a man voices a complaint, he's vulnerable to being accused of whining. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if maybe, the fact that a man is saying, oh, everything's fine. Yeah, it couldn't be better.
Yeah.
Which reminds me of my uncle, who was a salesman under a lot of pressure. How you doing, Uncle Bob? Fantastic, but it'll get better. And and you knew he was under a lot of pressure because when he came over on Sundays to have dinner with his mother, who lived with us as my grandmother, he and my father, all they talked about was money. Mm-hmm. All they talked about was money. Yeah. And women, on the other hand, if after dozens of years of hearing about how they're oppressed, and life isn't treating them fairly, I wonder if they might not be sort of predisposed to seeing goblins where the goblins don't really exist.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a couple things going on. Well, a number of things. One, in their relationships, the female-female relationships and male-male friendships and so forth, women are much more comfortable expressing negative things that are bothering them, and they talk it through. And so it's a more typical way of dealing with stress for women than with men. Men are more likely to joke around or try to divert attention from the issue and so forth. So I think certainly you're right. Women are much more comfortable generally voicing their concerns. The life satisfaction measure is kind of anonymous. It's just kind of, where you are on a ladder. Things are going great or not great. So I don't know if that bias would also express itself on that type of measure. It might, and I wouldn't be surprised if it does. And in fact, if you look at life satisfaction in highly developed, wealthy nations, women tend to be a little more satisfied even than men. And so if that bias is there, that satisfaction gap may even be larger than is being measured.
Yeah, I know that, again, my bias, my experience, what I believe, I don't have any studies to back me up, but, I gotta believe that the person who coined the phrase, life's a bitch and then you die, that was a man.
Yeah.
Life's a bitch and then you die.
Right.
Not terribly satisfied with his life. And then there's the saying, I forget who, most men live lives of quiet desperation. They're quiet. They're not talking about, they don't want to complain. They don't want to be seen as weak. They don't want to worry the wife. Yeah, everything's fine, honey. Yeah, everything's good. Pay no attention to the fact that I'm becoming an alcoholic and getting cranky and stressed out, and pay no attention to the fact that I had a heart attack when I was 47.
Right. Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. It's men are much more focused on cultural success, being successful in whatever context they're in, whether it's sales or herding cattle or whatever it might be. Takes a lot of focus, energy, so forth. Waning, complaining about things isn't getting things done. And so they're more focused on the outcome rather than feeling comfortable during the process. And as you say, in some contexts, complaining too much will reduce their status, especially among other men, but probably also among women.
Right. Whereas on the other hand, a woman whose voices her concerns and problems and needs is more likely than a man to have somebody say, "Oh, how can I help you?" What can I do for you?
Right.
Okay, so I want to talk with you a little bit about that later on. About your main problem with this report is that it tends to justify and is often used to promote governmental edicts that attempt to force equality where it's just not in the cards. Right?
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, if it was used as a measure of women's empowerment, so it's like, oh, how are women doing relative to men in political, economic spheres and other sorts of spheres, that's fine. But it's not really used that way. It's used as I said before, as a measure of equality. And by implication, anything less than 1.0 is an indication that something is wrong in society, that girls are being mistreated, and therefore there must be some type of government intervention to fix the problem. When really, in many wealthy, healthy, rich populations, there isn't really a problem.
And so some of these interventions would serve the purpose of making life even more difficult for men, because these interventions are going to accelerate and promote and grease the skids for women. So if a man has his eye on a promotion, well, guess what? You ain't getting it.
Right. Yeah. So they're setting up quotas based on equality of outcomes rather than preferences. So, do you want this promotion? Well, it means you have to work more. You have more responsibility, and you have to move 1,000 miles across country. Are you willing to do that?
Yeah.
No, more men than women are.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about the BIGI, your alternative to the was it the GGGI, the basic indicator of gender equality. Would you like to explain that?
Right. So when Heesbert and I were working on a number of cross-national data sets, and we were using the GGGI and looking at it, we became frustrated with it because it clearly was based on kind of activist and feminist biases, and the measure in and of itself wasn't what many people think it was. It isn't really a measure of equality per se. It's a measure of, as I said before, women's empowerment. So we wanted to come up with something a little bit different that was actually focused on equality of outcomes, that at least what we think is equality of outcomes, and was straightforward, transparent, easy to use, and we think people would agree with it. And our basic argument was that, well, what would be a good indicator that national governments are doing a good job for their citizens? Say, well, if their citizens have access to education, are living a long, healthy lifespan, and are satisfied with their life, then that's a pretty good indication. That education, we thought, was important because in many economies, of course, you have to be educated to have opportunities in them. If you are under a lot of economic stress or other types of stressors, people rate life satisfaction lower. If things are going pretty well or okay or whatever, people rate it higher. So it is correlated with actual outcomes in life. And then we figured, well, most people will probably want to live healthy and long. So we just took that as an assumption. And then we just combined those and looked at overall scores, who's doing better, who's doing worse, and under what conditions do we see differences. And one important difference in our scale is that it is possible for men to do worse than women. Whereas with the GGGI and some other measures, it's cut off where men can never do worse than women just because of how it's measured. And we find that in highly developed, wealthy nations, Men and women are all doing pretty well. And if there's any bias, women are doing a little bit better. They're doing better educationally and in terms of life satisfaction.
Yeah, the life satisfaction dots on your scatter plot were pretty striking to me. And I think you even pointed it out in your commentary that there are some pretty significant pretty significant results that indicate that women are better off in the life satisfaction index, especially in highly developed industrial nations.
Right. Yeah. So the US, Canada, Australia, much of Europe, and so forth, highly developed economies, generally pretty egalitarian, democratic, and so forth. Yeah. Women are more satisfied with their lives than men are. And, women have more options in their life generally than men do. As you implied earlier, men are expected to, and many want to, go out and be successful, in sales or whatever it is. But it's stressful. It can be a grind, and it never ends. You do it for 40 years or whatever. And some women want to do that as well, about 15% or so, but more women than not prefer a more balanced life where they have more options and they can spend more time with family, friends, their kids, or whatever.
Yeah, you're teeing up the last point that I want to get to in a few minutes. Before we leave the biggie, the three main measures were healthy life expectancy, basic education, and life satisfaction. Right. So the question I raised earlier was about the reliability of that life satisfaction indicator. What about BIGI? Why didn't BIGI and why doesn't GGGI use? Well, I know why GGGI doesn't do it, because these indicators would all come up as 1.0, indicating no problem for either sex. But did you ever think about using it in the BIGI objective enumerative indicators like homelessness or incarceration?
Yeah, we mentioned those in the article, that men are vastly overrepresented in incarceration, and overrepresented in homelessness and a number of other areas. Then we thought about that, and we wanted to keep it more simple, because you don't always have good data on those sorts of things, especially from developing nations. And so we don't know how reliable that data is. And then you're getting into, we got these 7 or 8 or 10 or even 20 indicators. Once you start picking and choosing 2 or 3, you kind of get into your own biases and stuff. So we wanted to keep it very straightforward, very simple, and measures where there's often just publicly available data collected by the UN or World Health Organization or whatever. So it's just easy to do.
Yeah. You didn't want to be accused of cherry picking. No good scientist does.
Right.
But it's interesting that the GGGI is nothing but a basket of cherries.
That's correct. Yeah. They pick, whoever put it together, some activists put it together, picked all the things that they think are important. Yeah. Not necessarily the things that women in general think are important. It's what they think are important.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the last point I want us to touch on. Sure. And it's sort of me expressing my optimistic self. I certainly agree with you that we don't want to have any governmental edicts that attempt to close gaps between men and women by saying we must have more women in certain categories where they might not really want to be. But could the problem be approached from the other end? You just mentioned that men are under a lot of stress. And, back in the day, 60 years ago, when the women's movement was first starting, a woman who wanted to be a lawyer was like, oh, what's wrong with her? She doesn't want to fulfill her natural, her basic nature as a woman. She wants to argue and fight. What's wrong with her? We have gotten over that to expand our idea of what makes a respectable, healthy, strong, capable, good citizen woman.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of the possibility that the reason you in your data have seen for hundreds of years, thousands of years, what you see isn't because men want to be out there doing what they're doing, all this stressful stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Some men, of course, really like the chase. They really like the challenge, but not every man.
Right.
What if the possibility that the reason they're doing what they gotta, what they're doing is because women really have a very significant upper hand. And I don't really want to work 80 hours a week to make money so that I can offer to buy a house for this woman that I want to marry. But I'm going to do it because if I don't, she's not going to be my wife. Right. What of the possibility that our culture might begin to value men for non-traditional male things? And by non-traditional male things, I sort of mean the mirror of non-traditional female things. It was non-traditional for a woman to want to be a lawyer and to fight and, scrap and, be in people's faces and confrontation. What if we now recognize that as a very healthy expression of womanhood, of a certain genre of womanhood. It's perfectly acceptable. What if we were to do the same thing for men and recognize that some men, not all men, maybe not the average man, but a significant number of men might really like to not have to work 80 hours a week and would really like to find a woman who does want to work 80 hours a week so that his interests can be the mirror of her interests. And he, though not getting what is called status, would still get life satisfaction out of possibly being the person who stays home taking care of the kids because he always loved kids and thinks of himself as a kind, caring, warm, gentle, patient, nurturing person that kids love and he loves them. Yeah. Could we close the gap by working it from the other end by giving men more options, just as we've noticed that women have more options than men these days?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's certainly there have been changes where it's kind of more acceptable now for these kind of role reversal sorts of things. I think the crossover is going to be more difficult for men for a number of reasons. One is the surveys are focused primarily on women in terms of work-life balance. And so we don't have as much, or at least I don't know, of the data that look at kind of how many men are really work-focused versus would like to be family-focused. It's for work-focused, we have that, and it's 50 to 70% or so. So it's a lot of guys are very career-focused. But obviously there are a significant number of guys who would like what you said, a more laid-back kind of mix of things, or just hanging out with the kids. So they're certainly there. One thing that potentially works against it is women's choices. Women generally prefer guys who are more successful than they are. And so if they're hard driving, making a lot of money, woman, they are looking for a guy who's of the same status, or from her perspective, preferably higher status. Now, not all women are like that. Some women do want kind of help at home and all of that. So there's that, but there's that kind of female choice bias in there as well that kind of keeps men working hard, and these other guys are kind of ignored as potential husbands by a lot of women who are focused on status.
So basically, I think what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what you're saying, and I agree with you, I think it's the case currently, is that women are looking for option enablers. which man is going to give me the greatest number of choices as I go through my life? It's going to be a man who can support me if I want to work 80 hours a week. He can support me if I want to work a half an hour a week.
Right.
So the question then becomes to me, why? And I think as a biological anthropologist, is that the proper term?
Psychologist.
A psychologist.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're a biological psychologist. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that.
So what is the basis of women having the upper hand here? Why is it not that men can say, all right, well, that's interesting. I'm glad, you're very clear on the kind of man you want, but that ain't me. See you later. And, Bob Dylan sang about that. It ain't me, babe.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So, for mammalian reproduction, the women are providing the parenting. They're the ones that can have the offspring, the kids, and so forth. And so that gives them kind of the upper hand when it comes to choice. They have, and then men are more interested in sex than women, and so that dynamic kind of makes a heavier bias toward female choice, which means most young females, women could have more than one guy, competing for her, and so there's kind of an imbalance of power there when it's based on choice, and so women have just basically evolved to be more picky than men.
Yeah. Okay. I get that a lot. And we have pretty much run up against the time limit that we wanted to set, or that I wanted to set, about 35 minutes. I would love to talk with you about this more, about the idea of reproduction, sending your genes into future generations, and those kinds of things. Maybe we can do that again another time. So I'll ask our listeners to keep an eye out on the newsletter that you can get from Male Friendly Media, and keep an eye out for another appearance by David Geary.
Sure.
David,
thanks.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. And I might mention before I go that I wrote a book on these dynamics called Male Female. It's in its third edition, and just a brand new edition came out just last autumn.
Okay, so very good. We will include that in the show notes. Is there any other contact information or your website that you would like to provide at this point?
Yeah, I don't have a personal website, just a faculty website at the University of Missouri. So they could look me up there, and it has lists of recent articles and books and stuff. And
I'll look forward to having you back again another time. Thank you so much.
Sounds
David.
great. You're welcome.
Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Men Are Talking. Did we deliver? Did you hear something that made you think, wow, I never thought of it like that? If we did, tell your friends.